So I think that there's a lot of connections between what Jeremy's just been talking about and what we're going to talk about in this presentation. This notion of ruptures of social fabric, the issues of stigma, what can be done, the mourning, what can be done to help people mourn in these situations were all things we came across in our research. But just to say a bit about what the research was, first of all, myself, Camilo, Ernesto, we have Gabriela, we have David Danella, we have Zulia, we have David Shirk. There's a whole big group of us involved in a project called Mobile Solutions to the Mexican Kidnapping Epidemic. And Camilo and I have worked on the bit to do with the border dynamics. And in looking at the border dynamics, there's two sort of dominant themes that came out to us. One was issues of mobility, which has been mentioned already. And the other, which I think applies to kidnapping in its various forms, is the issue of intimacy that came through within our work. And when we talk about intimacy, we want to think about it as something more than emotional co-presence, you know, thinking of the family immediately. But what we are trying to do is to broaden that out. And what we found instructive is the work of Forstey, who talked about intimacy as containing a blend of affect, shared knowledge, mutual action, and norms, that it's a flexible analytical concept. And in this way we see, in this way we see intimacy happening not just amongst family members, not just being disrupted amongst family members, but also in relationships of negotiations during kidnappings, also within relationships within lots of different groups shaped and affected by kidnapping. So when I say intimacy interrupted, the obvious thing we think about is, oh, the family member is missing. But just to give an example of something that comes from an asylum application, an unsuccessful one that was shared with us for someone from Tijuana, she talked about the longer disruptive effects on the family that came with the kidnapping and disappearance. She said, it started with the kidnapping of my brother. I think we all turned inward or elsewhere. When a loved one is kidnapped and suffering, it is hard to smile, eat, talk, laugh, sleep. But when the kidnapping goes on for so long, and as everyone is trying to cope with it in his or her own way, there is always disapproval, antagonism, or blame between the ones waiting. The problems that began with my brother's abduction became more severe with the outcome. And when we lived abroad, it continued to deteriorate. Something that I thought was indestructible broke. My parents decided to separate. And what I want to talk about today is notions of intimacy being betrayed, intimacy being lost, attempts to restore and preserve intimacy as well for people affected by kidnapping. And I think, Ilke, when you talked this morning about the thing of coming across the border in your family, feeling, you know, you told us this before, but your mother feeling reassured that you are safe during that period is part of this choice to insert distance in the relationship to preserve the relationship. And this is what we've called the intimacy distance paradox. So like it's been mentioned, and we won't have time to talk about all of these, but you have a reducing of the social circle. You have people who live under self-imposed mobility regimes, autocontention. You have people who relocate their family across the border. People who devise anti-kidnapping strategies that won't indulge emotion when someone in their family is kidnapped, that will try and preserve the unit of the family, maybe at the expense of one of the family, a fatalistic approach. Businesses that get managed remotely, and things like sending kids to school or university across the border. So whilst we're broadening out the notion of kidnapping beyond the extortionate form of kidnapping, there's various other forms. I think we need to also broaden out the notion of intimacy as well. And briefly, just to talk about the way intimacy crops up within writing about kidnapping, a couple of things have come across. So Wendy Vogt has written about intimacy and intimate labor and migrant kidnapping, and how relationships of reciprocity and solidarity can be used in an improvised way to prevent migrants from being kidnapped. And intimacy itself is an activity, of course, which is predatory upon intimacy. If we didn't care about those loved ones, we wouldn't be able to be leveraged to pay for them. And something that was interesting about, we think of the intimate as the private, but in the work of Ingrid Hernandez in Tijuana, she talks about how some objects that appear in public space open up very intimate circumstances. So an image there of a safe house that was used by the Arellano Felix cartel, with the various notices depicting what it is, and then the images that would be familiar for everybody, for people who've gone missing or disappeared, and all of those different images of a family member that are posted, whether it's online, whether it's a poster on a wall. There's an intimate aspect of people's lives surrounded by violence that lies behind that. So the intimate and the public, coexist. But what we're looking at is the mechanisms of loss of intimacy. And so the first thing I wanted to talk about is the betrayal of intimacy. A recurrent theme, and that, bear in mind, a lot of the people that we talked to, I think, more of them were from privileged backgrounds, and that sort of elite extortionate kidnapping than from poorer backgrounds. But the treason phenomenon that Ochoa talks about, who is it that gave me away? Who gave the information about my whereabouts, about my wealth, about who could be leveraged? And in his work, he says, I don't know where the statistic comes from, but in 70% of cases that there was some case of betrayal. And then when we got to Tijuana and we did the field work there, a phenomenon that came up to us was a phenomenon of las listas, which was new to us, but I don't think it's probably new to anyone who lives in Tijuana, which was that during the period that there was the peak of kidnappings, when people were kidnapped, a condition of release was giving up the names of other kidnapped prospects. And this creates a really complicated situation because, as the quotation says at the bottom, you get worried when your friend gets kidnapped because your friend or your colleague knows about you, knows about your life, knows about roughly what you earn, maybe works in the same building. And the end of it is what's interesting. I'm sure I would do it if I was in the same situation. I mean, I wouldn't blame him. So this particular doctor, would be closing off his social circle. Plenty of money, but didn't have domestic help in his house. And so we have this sort of osmotic paranoia that follows las listas. But then if we broaden out the notion of intimacy, we get to the point that kidnapping negotiations are parasitic upon shared intimate knowledge about the target's movement and vulnerabilities, about the family's wealth and assets. But the kidnap negotiations also action intimacy. Because when a proof of life is made and the response is given, well, there's a reassurance that that relative, that person is still alive at that moment. That conditions the continuance of the negotiation. And as horrible as it may be to receive a severed body part, that severed body part can also signal that that relative is still alive. So very intimate things are shared within the negotiation between the kidnapper, the victim, and the relatives. But at the start of the process, we have this betrayal of intimacy that goes to this disruption of the social fabric that Jeremy was talking about. And like the peaks of the kidnapping were in Tijuana and Juarez were the end of the first decade of the 2000s. But one of the things that came through also in Tijuana was the proximity in life of the kidnappers to the people. So we interviewed a restaurateur who said the Arellano Felix would come to our restaurant. They knew who they were, and so they were living and working in the same place that the kidnapped group was. So there's, again, the proximity, the intimacy is there in that really weird situation of being confronted with the threat on right in front of you, maybe serving them their dinner. So this leads to, what do you do about that problem? And the way we've thought about this is the intimacy distance paradox. That you have intimacy, but to preserve it, you have to give something up. So to safeguard the relationship, you insert distance into the relationship. And in one of our interviews, there was a very fatalistic approach given by the interviewee, who said basically, if someone was taken, they're taken, and we're not going to pay the ransom. And this was because they came from a journalistic family, and they didn't want repeat victimization, and they were scared that them being intimidated had other knock-on effects of censorship and other things. And the same person said, yes, it's horrible, but then, of course, when that decision was made, I didn't even think twice of taking my kids away across the border to the US. So we see a separation of the family unit to preserve the family unit. And clearly a fatalism. The husband stayed behind, the mother and the children moved across the border. So the upshot is a sort of voluntary form of sacrifice, or separating the family in order to limit the effects of the kidnapping. And the way we've decided to conceptualize this is we call it TransBorder Secession. So secession is to retreat away from the threat, right? And in literature about, white Americans not wanting to mix with other parts of the community, Henderson has talked about automotive secession. People retreat into their SUVs, they retreat into the suburbs. In this case, what we have is people retreating across the border, as Jeremy alluded to, moving to nicer areas, those who can afford to, usually on investor visas or because of, dual nationality, moving just across the border to the other side of the city. So when you go to Chula Vista, or you go to Otay Ranch, or you go to East Lake, you find these gilded colonies, what is called, a newspaper article called Gilded Colonies of Mexicans. And one we found when we were doing the field work was very conveniently called Enclave for us, which I said that's going to go on a slide. And what we find is that, as one of the interviewees said, not everyone has the luxury of knowing both sides, right? And that's been made perfectly obvious today. But for those who can, they have this circular mobility. They can cross the border, they can get the sentry pass, they can manage things at a distance. But there is still a price of this. There's a human toll in lost intimacy. Family and business connections become remote. And there's a stigma of having abandoned the place that you come from. You've abandoned the city, and you've abandoned others to the danger, whilst I'm all right, Jack, right? I got across. So for another respondent, she said, the distance for me is almost 8 years of living away from my husband. It really does take a toll because you do grow apart, and that is the reality. So the bigger cost, so I think there is a bigger cost than one would have expected, or than I would have expected. So there's an impact on family relations, an impact on how businesses are managed across the border. There's a stigma of abandoning their home city. And then there's also a lack of intimacy in the place that they move to. Do they find a way to integrate into their new life across the border? And that's another challenge that we encountered. This is just some graphics that I borrowed from a BBC sort of mini documentary about kidnapping. And I thought it was also worth talking about the place of the negotiator in notions of intimacy and distance and kidnap and ransom. When we went to do when we got the award for the project, of course we have to do all our health and safety stuff for the university, so we had to do kidnap and ransom training. And
anti-kidnapping.
Yeah. and anti. Shit.
He's more kidnappable than me,
Yeah.
according to the segment.
The good news is I'm okay. The bad news is for Camilo. But it was an interesting experience because I wasn't thinking about the issue of distance and intimacy then. These are things that come through. But when I look back on it now, when the trainer, who is also a negotiator from Mexico, talked to us, he talked about mechanisms of sort of distanciation within the negotiations and prolonging them, or who you choose, because they don't do the negotiations usually. They will appoint someone who is less emotionally, pliable or more open to manipulation. So the the negotiator is another person who has an intimate awareness of what's going on, but also tries to insert some distance within what's going and what's happening and to control it. So that's another dimension that we're looking at exploring: intimacy and its connection with distance in kidnap and ransom scenarios. Another thing that just occurred with a kidnapping that took place in Tijuana. They chose to bring in a negotiator from Mexico City because they were worried about the guy from Playas de Tijuana already being within the loop of whatever else was going on in Tijuana. So, like, before handing it over to Camilo, I just wanted to show this. This is a famous letter that was written by Eiko Enriquez Nishikawa in Tijuana in 2008. Her brother was kidnapped and disappeared. And we talked about the stigma, the victim blaming that happens with kidnapped victims. And this is almost like an attempt to address that, because the intimacy gets corrupted. We met with people who basically almost don't leave the house because of the stigma that's been placed on them by their family member being kidnapped and then being disappeared. And this is an attempt to reclaim the good reputation of the family, an attempt to reassert that good name, and also to lay down a challenge to the state. The upshot was she still had to leave the country with threats afterwards. But it's a very interesting case, and again, we talked about body parts earlier, and Jeremy talked about some of the graphic things that happened. Their source of memory is the finger that was sent. That's all they have that's left, and that is their source of having somewhere to go to remember their brother. But so the question that arises, and I think it's a big challenging question in the Mexican context and the patterns of Levantons and the patterns of express kidnappings, is how do you preserve and restore intimacy? And with that, I'll hand over to Camilo to talk about some of issues of technology.
Yeah.
Techniques.
So welcome to the second part of this double act. So now it's me. So I just want to focus briefly for 5 minutes in one of the dimensions that we're working with Conor when we start doing this approach, and it's the relationship between technologies, intimacy, and kidnapping. So one of the issues, or one of the topics that start to be really interesting to explore is like the challenges that technology is providing us to now to understand kidnapping and kidnapping situations. So we think that there's two challenges that we need to start thinking when they start doing this relationship between intimacy and kidnapping. And one is trying to understand the role of technologies in the affective dimensions of intimacy in context of kidnapping. And I want to address just two particular points. One, any technology is neutral. When you use any kind of technology, you have a personal relationship with the technology, and it's not like a simple using some device. You have a personal relation, a rapport with them. And secondly, you develop some affection with or through technologies. And the second big challenge is like how to understand this relationship between physical co-presence, technologies of connection, and how intimacies are achieved in face-to-face interaction during the kidnapping versus technologically mediated interaction during and after kidnapping. So it's like trying to understand two dimensions of the same relationship. One, how technology is providing some kind of co-presence or kind of relationships during the kidnapping and after the kidnapping. And two notions start to come like really important to understand the challenges, and it's the techniques of connection. So how we connect in all these kind of contexts, how we start to create different uses of technology to address the issues, and how to start, 2 minutes, and how we can to understand technologies of intimacy, how we can create these kind of patterns. So just to give you in 1 minute some examples about this issue, one is from Colombia. I'm going to talk about Colombia tomorrow, but it's a really famous radio program called Voices of Kidnapping, Los Voces de los Secuestrados. Was a program to the families of and relatives of people that was kidnapped. You start to get through the radio. So it was a radio show for 2-3 hours in the Colombian, at the beginning was in the public radio station, after was in the private, but that's another issue. And people that were kidnapped just start listening their relatives and messages from the family. So if you can see, it's a kind of be connected through technology and how you can use technology to feel, I don't know, like a worm in this in terms of captivity when you are in this kind. But I'm going to explain this in more tomorrow. The other issue of technology is like when you develop transborder monitoring, and this is part of the kidnapping that we did with Conor here in Juarez and Tijuana, and it's called how families start to live like transborder situations using CCTV cameras, so to monitoring like families to see that everything is okay, and it's a kind of way to be co-presence through technology with the families and stuff. And finally, one of the more famous uses of technology in terms of prevention of kidnapping or just is the tracking. So GPS trackers that you can use to see where is your relatives and all the stuff. Trackers on mobile phones, that is another stuff. Panic buttons, and of course, how these technologies can you use for kidnapping purposes like the virtual kidnapping. But this is some relationship that we started working, but it's just to address the importance of technology in this kind of context. So thank you, and let's go to Zulia. Yeah.